You're on the air. Don't say anything crazy.
And welcome back to Brobears Talk, ladies and germs. It's been a while. We had a bit of a break, Brotherly Bear. I think we owe our audience a massive apology.
We certainly do, and in a better world, I would like to say we went on summer recess, but we certainly didn't. We were just being lazy.
There's no good excuse. It was mostly laziness. I'd like to use the excuse of work, but if I really look deeply in my heart, that is probably a side reason as opposed to the main front and center reason. So,
Yes.
No, we are back. We are back. We are back with a bang.
Pow.
Brotherly Bear, this one I was mulling over because I had so much time as to what we talk about, and I've flip-flopped all over the shop.
Yes, sir.
And kind of it's been answered for me. So I was initially thinking about consciousness and how we should discuss actually what consciousness is, why it is that I perceive reality through this body and this identity and this being. Why do I perceive the world through the back of this particular skull, this head? Why have I embodied this particular being? It's a bizarre question, and I don't think we have the answer to that. But I think we'll park that for another day because I think the events in Afghanistan are just so current and so pressing. I think it would be wrong to discuss anything but that. And so in this podcast, I think I'll lean on you for a lot of the historical context as to how we got into the position we're in today. But if I'm not wrong, this all started in the Bush administration, and by the Bush administration, when following the 9/11 attacks, they decided that to fight Al-Qaeda, whose, I suppose, biggest presence or most prominent presence was in Afghanistan, there was, I suppose, two objectives which were outlined in Biden's recent speech. One was to, first and foremost, capture and kill Osama bin Laden. The second was to, I suppose, dampen the effect or the impact and reach of Al-Qaeda in the region. And arguably, Joe Biden said we've accomplished both of those things, however, left a country in something of a mess despite 20 years of investment, training, lives, suffering, and pain.
Very well put, Brother Bear. Now, I will start by saying I think that you are correct in the deferring of the consciousness topic. Instead we'll be talking about the situation in Afghanistan, and I feel like that's a more timely topic. 2001 is when the current war in Afghanistan started, the US war in Afghanistan, and the timeline from the US government regarding the Taliban insurgency is actually dating it from 1999 to 2021, which it's talked about the finality of the situation we're in now. People are comparing it to the fall of Saigon in Vietnam.
Yes,
it's a very emotive time for US personnel, but also British personnel, Canadian, French, all the forces that were involved in Afghanistan, towns and cities where people's relatives died in the war. So it's a very emotional time. But I will say this, the US influence in Afghanistan has far predated that 1999 initial year, and I think the presence of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 80s. I think it was actually 79 to 89. You saw them rolling the tanks in from Russia. The US had its hand in that as well. The CIA played quite a central role in asserting US influence by funding operations designed to destroy the Soviets. So we can talk a bit about that later, Brother Bear, but let's definitely unpack some of the foreign policy implications of what's just happened.
Yeah, definitely. I really wanted to get into that because I really think you can bring so much to the table here with your, because you're such a you do love history, and I think you have a very good understanding of history, whether that's particularly the political aspects, and I think that's just your natural interest, right, coming to the fore. That's something you've always been interested in, if I'm not wrong.
No, that's true, Brother Bear. I mean, I've always been a history buff and a politico, but as a geographer, a human geographer, as you know, geopolitics is my game, and I always found sort of the international relations aspect really interesting too.
No, absolutely. I know you you're quite fond of the Noam Chomsky books. I want to get into some of his writings. I know he was able to write very concise books, but actually pack quite a punch with very few words, and I think that's an enviable skill that I'd like to emulate one day. It's quite something to deliver, an impactful, lasting impression with very few words. I think it's a true art. But without getting on the tangent of Noam Chomsky, which we could very easily do because we're good at that, getting back to the point in hand, and just firstly, let's just understand the crazy, almost blitzkrieg-esque approach and almost taking back of Afghanistan by the Taliban. It's just been crazy how fast it moved. I mean, Biden in his speech yesterday was honest and I think transparent that it did take them by surprise. I think to what extent it took them by surprise, he was probably hiding, and that's that's the political game. But it is shocking from an external perspective how there was little to no resistance from the Afghanistan army, which had been trained up. I mean, we're talking about 300,000 strong here. This isn't a tiny army by any stretch. This is a bigger an army than many of the NATO nations.
Yes.
So to offer up little to no resistance, there is an argument to be said for the country should. I mean, look, I think a country should be determining its own future, and so if things go this way, whatever way they go, ultimately the US leaving, no one's naive in thinking that the US and the allied troops could stay there on indefinitely. There was always going to be this transition. I think it's not so much that people have a problem. I think on the whole, people don't have a problem or a question over whether troops should have left or not eventually. That question, and the answer to that question is obvious. Yes, they should have left. I think it was the manner in which it was handled, right? It was all too abrupt, and it left this crazy power vacuum which was filled in a matter of weeks.
Yeah.
And I think it's that people have a problem with.
Definitely
I tend
abruptness.
to side with that.
Yeah, you're right. I think the word is abrupt. It almost seems like there was very little warning. And it's thrown into question, what has triggered this really. I mean, there are pundits, like, for example, Congressman Ron Paul, who have been calling for withdrawal of US presence in Afghanistan for years. But it's often been, the tone's often been, let's do this gradually. Let's ensure that a lot of the training is in place to, try and fill that void. You're right, it definitely seemed incredibly abrupt. And it also puts into question, what were the true reasons behind that? Were they financial? Were some of the implications of the coronavirus pandemic to answer for some of this? I suppose was it a cost-cutting exercise to sequester the military there because of that?
Well, I think the US, when above and beyond in sense of the numbers I've seen and how long over the last essentially 20 years they've been building up and training the army, and that's not just the US military, that's the UK military. The best militaries arguably in the world have been training up these soldiers, equipping them with the best and latest weaponry, and for that army to offer up zero resistance against, or little to no resistance against the Taliban, is just downright disappointing. And I don't shy away from that word because I think it's sad that, or maybe it's not, right? Maybe this is the future they want. I don't understand. It's just strange to me how an army doesn't seem to be bothered at all. It's just so un-army-like to offer up no resistance against, they had their numbers, they had the equipment. It wasn't like there's a proper root cause or reason as to why they should not resist. And so I'd like to almost get into that at some point to understand that reason.
There's definitely a delta in our understanding of why the Afghan army was so quick to fall. Looking at the bare financials, and this figure's getting thrown around a lot, and it's between $2 and $2.2 trillion has been spent since 2001 in Afghanistan, and that's a cost of war calculation by Brown University, and that was at $83 billion that was pumped into. We're not really even talking about weaponry there, or the cost of US personnel. I suppose the training figure for
That's
the
purely
Afghans,
training
for security forces, Afghan security forces. So you raise a great point for the forces to collapse so quickly and so completely. it's sad, really. I mean, I don't really understand why there was that rapid fall.
Ambivalence.
Yeah. Was it ambivalence, or was it just a case of they were outnumbered? Was it a case of that the Taliban had been so present, they were hiding, in the ranks in the mountains for so long, and they were just completely outnumbered the Afghan army? I'm just not sure.
Now, this is so fresh off the press, I've not had a chance to do a deep dive as to the root causes as to why there was no resistance, or little to no resistance offered up, but it just baffles me, and I'm almost lost for words as to why they'd want that. And it almost, you naturally come to the conclusion, without having done any real deeper research, that they're simply not that bothered one way or the other as to the future. Maybe it's just a symptom of a nation that's tired of war.
It could be the case. That's the thing. But if we're talking about the mass public, obviously, I feel that particularly women, but the general public are incredibly fearful of a Taliban government. Not that Western...
Well, it's the uncertainty now. We just don't know where we're going to land. And, they're trying to set up these press conferences. I think the first of which was yesterday, and these are supposed to become now a regular occurrence, whereby the Taliban are sort of taking up this quite diplomatic, or at least from an external perspective, the public perspective, and how they want the world to see them. Because I think they're not stupid, and they're conscious that the world is watching. And so they want to be, setting off on the right foot, as far as they can do that, with all of the reputation and baggage that comes with the word Taliban.
They're certainly trying to come across as a more organised and centralised organisation than perhaps the Taliban we were familiar with 5 or 10 years ago.
Almost like ambassadorial, diplomatic, those sorts of words come to mind.
Yeah, they do, although I don't know about the US or Britain. Although the Canada isn't currently recognising them.
No, I suppose I'm saying those words in terms of how they would like to be perceived externally, out in the Western world and the world at large. But it's such an uncertain time, and those haunting pictures, I'm sure you've seen them, of the Kabul airport and the desperation of people, throwing themselves onto moving planes, people falling off planes. It's just unimaginable. Like, we can't even get close to fathoming the desperation that drives a human being to do that.
Yeah, it's so sad, and you see pictures of little children being pushed over the walls into the compound to, even go with strangers just to get them onto a plane that's heading away. And you must think, that the collective memory of the Taliban, the beginning of the 2000s must just be so violent, and hearing some of the stories from some of my mum's students, from people who fled the Taliban and came to Britain, it's just, words couldn't describe, the horror that as a group they imposed on people that didn't believe in their idea of theocracy.
Yeah, there's a part of me that wants to believe they've changed, but to be perfectly honest, when I look at it in the stark light of day, I find it hard to believe, an institution, an organisation with the history of theirs is able to change to the extent that they'd like us to think. I don't think it's quite possible. I just really want to believe that they have, right? Because what's the alternative? Essentially, a rerun of the atrocities that we've seen in the past.
But you do raise a good point in the sense that, are they tired of war? I know there was a spokesman for the Defence Secretary. The statement he issued, I think it was a couple of days ago, was, money can't buy will, you cannot purchase leadership. And I think he was referring to the fact that sometimes however much money you throw at a country's army, and however much technology you give them, it's not, that doesn't necessarily convince them to defend a country if the will isn't there.
100%, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think I'm starting to think, and the more I think about it, even now, it's a mental thing. Their heart's not in it. Their mind's
At least the armies isn't. I mean, the public.
It's not.
It's just hard to know what people think, but obviously we're seeing. Yeah.
I know, but
army.
the army is supposed to defend its people, right? And anyway, I think this warrants almost a follow-up podcast in any case, but it just at this point, I think it's just a confusion as to why little to no resistance was offered up, and if no resistance was offered up, then it's maybe what the country wanted, but that does not seem to be the case, judging by the vivid fear in people in terms of their actions, in terms of fleeing, and that memory still seems very raw. It's amazing to think that there's certain, for example, a well-adjusted, mature 20-year-old doesn't know the horrors of the Taliban potentially, because they've never really lived through a time where the Taliban were a ruling force.
Yeah. I mean, let's see. It's all speculative right now what the generational difference may do, but definitely, I think for you and I, Andre, we're in our late 20s now, and that. I think Afghanistan has been a conflict that we've been familiar with for our entire lives, and
yes,
not that there was a draft in the UK or anything like that, but I think it's kind of the equivalent to our Vietnam, in the sense that Iraq was a lot more cut and dry. The Ba'ath Party was overthrown, and the US withdrawal was more swift. Afghanistan has been sort of a long-term conflict, and it's definitely in the collective memory of those in the generation before us from the Soviet invasion as well. So I think it's interesting talking to baby boomers, because Afghanistan has always been fairly unstable, but in the 70s and earlier, 60s and 70s, it grew to the status of a tourist destination for many years, particularly to kind of the hippie youths of that time. And
that's really interesting. I think there was almost a similar movement in Iran at the time, and maybe this was a broader movement would be worth warranting sort of doing a deep dive on, of more liberal times in the Middle East, because there are photos of Tehran in the 70s, and you'd be forgiven for thinking it was somewhere in Mediterranean. The sorts of clothes people were wearing, the general ambience, the atmosphere. It just seemed like a more liberal, happier time.
Yeah, I think it certainly was, and I'm not familiar with what the incumbent government was during those years. But the 1979 Soviet invasion, 79, obviously you're right, in the midst of the Cold War. So there's always been a bit of animosity towards the US from people critical of hawkish foreign policy, just because it's well known that they played a significant role in arming up Afghan insurgents at the time, and different guerrilla rebel groups. And this really, they shot themselves in the foot long term. Even though the Soviet forces did withdraw, and the Afghan civil war continued, it had that constant instability. So there's just generally a feeling that the US long term actually assisted the Taliban and empowered them.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard some people go as far as to say, the US ultimately sort of almost created the Taliban, and created a cause for them as well. But it's interesting because guerrilla warfare is rarely a winnable war for the other side. So you had the comparison in Vietnam earlier. That was a definite win for the guerrilla warfare. Same is true of the Taliban. I wonder if it's almost the decentralized, untouchable nature of guerrilla warfare that it's so hard to find, to pinpoint, and it's kind of everywhere and nowhere. And walking around or doing patrols in Kabul, you just wouldn't know who's friend or foe. Just imagining that from a UK or a US soldier's point of view, the IEDs, are the farmers is this particular small settlement, this village, with the Taliban or not? How are you going to find out? Or, who's lying, who's not? And it's just this. I can imagine it was a very sort of time of trepidation and unsure of like who's who, and just switching gears for a second, almost understanding. I was never a fan of the fact that the US almost saw themselves as the police of the world. I think, as you said, put it, the hawkish policy that they seem to have adopted in many geographies across the world over time. I think it's right that they pulled out. I don't think the US should dictate what countries do and what they follow and what policies and politics are in favour and what should be, I suppose, the ruling party's politics. So I'm glad that's happened. I think it just goes back to the manner in which they've come out of Afghanistan. It's just created this vacuum that's appeared all too quickly, and it was only going to be filled by the Taliban. But I think you're in agreement and alignment with the idea that the US shouldn't be meddling in these sorts of countries and shouldn't be, as Joe Biden put it, nation building. That should be sort of the will and drive of the nation and the people of that nation, right?
Yeah, I mean, here's where the difficult that's kind of the $1 million question, really, because in the eyes of the world, when it comes to foreign policy, the US finds itself in quite a difficult position in that they're kind of damned if they do help and damned if they don't. They have the economic might unlike any civilization has seen. They invest 10 times more than the second largest military in their own technology and personnel. And I think that people see that as, okay, we need an ROI on this. We need some kind of return. So it's difficult because it's very easy to peddle this, they shouldn't be involved in policing the world. And I myself I find myself in that camp more than the hawkish camp. But, I think there's definitely some sympathy there I have for the US in the sense that, how long can this go on for? Are they meant to have significant presence in Afghanistan for another 100 years or another 500 years? I mean, how, with a country so unstable, what is the moral thing to do? And that's what the bread and butter of this question is.
I think you're right, and I think this again goes back to what Biden said, or at least what he read off the teleprompter, around, how much longer would they have to stay to have a different outcome from the one that transpired? And there's no obvious answer. And you're right. I don't think 5 years, 10 years, 20 years would have made a blind bit of difference. To be perfectly honest, I think the Taliban would have been waiting in the wings to jump in at the earliest opportunity. And I'm not sure any amount of training, any amount of billions and trillions would change that.
No. That's the thing. Can you just throw money at a problem and hope that it goes away? I mean, there were some estimates in the late 80s that, they were hidden in the mountainous and rugged terrain of Afghanistan, but that the Taliban were actually controlling roughly 80% of guerrilla forces back then. I don't know how much that changed in more present day, but there's obviously widespread support in some of the rank and file public there.
I think it's the uncertainty now. That's what everyone's concerned about, particularly for women and girls. I mean, Sharia law has been known. I mean, they talk about Islamic law, Islamic fundamentalism, and they've been very vague when pressed on the question of what will happen to women and girls. In fact, when they first not stormed, but I suppose waltzed into the presidential palace, there were even scenes in the background of people, certain Taliban fighters painting over women who didn't have a full burqa on, literally painting over such paintings and murals. So I think that's quite telling, and I think only time will tell but I'm not optimistic. Let's put it that way.
No, I mean, I would say that it's a foregone conclusion that women's rights will be stripped away. And, whether that happens officially or unofficially, the atrocities that were committed not so long ago upon women probably remain. So you're right. I think the uncertainty is the word, and that's why people are fleeing. I think the goal is as well for a lot of the public to get young girls and women out of the country before the Taliban sort of, setting up structures to enact that misogyny on the public.
Yeah, it's terrifying, and I think we can't begin to fathom, the fear, the existential fear that, I mean, we worry about such trivial problems. Oh, I'm a bit stressed at work. Like, it just looks silly compared to real world problems, right? That's what a real problem looks like. Not knowing whether you'll be educated, let alone live for the next week.
Really is, yeah. That's the first thing Ronil said to me this morning when I was reading the news, and he said, it's funny. You can take the argument of victimhood to the nth degree. Really, it almost becomes a nonsense conversation when you look at the atrocities that people are suffering in countries like this.
It definitely puts things in perspective, and it makes you realise, how grateful we should be for the lottery of life that we've been born where we've born, and we've got this very favourable, let's be honest, circumstances that we enjoy the rewards from. Because most people, in fact, aren't so lucky. And so, I think gratefulness for is something that we could all do well to practice more of. And it's events like this kind of that put things into sharp perspective very quickly. One image that gave me some hope and happiness actually out of all of this, all of these unfolding events over the last week or so, was one image of a C-17 Globemaster, the US transporter workhorse of the US Air Force. And they're massive, right? They're sort of built to transport Humvees, tanks, all the rest of it. They're sort of the backbone of the US Air Force transporter fleet and cargo fleet. And I saw this image on the BBC News of roughly, I think, over 600 Afghans who had stormed into the cargo bay of one of these C-17 Globemaster transport planes, and they were sitting there. In fact, it may have been the one that people were running behind and trying to clamber on. But instead of shooing them out and I suppose trying to get the people out of the plane, they actually decided to let them stay on board. And they took off with all of those around 600 plus Afghans on board, which is just great. At least those guys might see a better life. And I love the fact they didn't, try and get them off the plane. They allowed them to stay on and took off. And whether that was out of convenience or whatever, I think it's just one small little, candle of hope and happiness that at least some of them, a small handful, managed to escape. Yeah.
There are little glimpses of hope in there, right? When you see planes
and I was
taking
even
off.
Like, exactly, and to think that people were on there, heading to a better future and potentially being the next breakthrough scientist who discovers the cure for cancer, who knows? But I was zooming into even the faces on that plane, and I wouldn't say that I was looking for happiness, right, on their faces, but I think there was still so much fear. Because let's be honest, although they're going to an unknown destination, all that was on their minds was to get out of where they were.
I suppose it's just the memory of the amount of danger they just escaped from, but also the uncertainty of what's the destination going to be. Will they be able to stay there, or will they not be deemed worthy by whatever Western country they're heading to, and will they be sent back?
And leaving with nothing but the clothes on your body. It's just...
And this takes it back to the first principle of just life, right? I mean, I'm sure many of those on the plane have got houses and possessions. Some of them may be quite well off. But does any of that really matter? It really comes down to just preserving the self and trying to take yourself and family out of that situation.
Yeah, exactly. It's the people around you that matter. I don't know, that sounds cheesy, but everything else, all your material possessions, your house, your investment, everything, it's all superfluous when it comes down to it. and the chips are down, then it really is just those closest to you.
Yeah,
That's it.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So these are really worrying times, and I think it's quite sad as well. I'll shift gears a little bit. It's not just sad for the individuals involved in, the Afghani citizens themselves, that are trying to escape this terrible situation, but I think it must be quite harrowing for veterans in the US too, and the family of veterans. I saw it was an Afghan Army, US Army memorial in Pennsylvania. I watched some of that this morning, and just the level of sadness and feeling of, what was it all for, really? What was the point of going into this country, putting lives on the line, and seeing brothers and sisters die beside you, just for everything to come tumbling down and for the Taliban to be back in power.
This is a very appropriate segue, and this is exactly what I wanted to get onto. So thank you, Brother Bear, for taking us here, because I was looking at an interview with a Royal Marine who'd had both of his legs blown off, and he's never going to walk ever again in his life and spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. And he was even articulating the words of, what was it all for? Was it worth it? And you could see in his eyes he was a very genuine person, and a person who genuinely believed that their time and effort and lives and money spent there were going to make that country better for Afghanis. And it feels like a waste of time and life, because it feels like they're back to square one in many ways.
Exactly, and I think this is why their parallels are being made to the fall of Saigon, with US troops being disgraced and sent home, obviously hated by people who were against the war, but hated by people who were for the war, who see them as failing, as servicemen and servicewomen. I think there's a real sense of, what was the point of this, of getting into such a costly and bloody conflict, only for the exact enemy that you're fighting against to take almost full control of that country a few years later.
Right, and the families who've lost husbands and sons. It's this is going to take, in some ways maybe their death could be more justified, if I can say that, had there been a rosier outcome, whereby there was real progress for the people of Afghanistan, and people did have a proper future, and there wasn't this, as I'm titling this podcast, the Afghan Regression.
It's a good title. No, that's a very appropriate title. Yeah, I just think I think this throws into question as well the kind of general US foreign policy and what they really hope to get out of being involved in other territories. Because, to be quite frank, since World War II, the US has had a particularly rosy track record. Korea ended in a stalemate. Vietnam was a 20-year war that ended in, a huge amount of societal debt, and that was a loss. And now we see ourselves in these kind of never-ending Middle Eastern conflicts that seem to have no net gain for the country involved in invading that country, and the country itself, in this case Afghanistan, it seems to have just been a net loss all around.
Yeah, and this is exactly what sort of leads me to believe maybe a cynical approach in some people's eyes, but a more of a laissez-faire approach, and let countries self-determine, right? Whatever that looks like.
Yeah, and I think a lot of politicians, particularly on the libertarian right, talk about the military-industrial complex and the weapons contracts and the kind of commercial, deep involvement of commercial interests in warfare, almost tantamount to that of the pharmaceutical industry, drives involvement in the Middle East, opposed to the greater good of the invader or the invaded.
Well, that's the last time you're mentioning military industrial complex before we have a podcast on it, because it's literally featured in all of them, and I love it, Brother Bear, that I'd really love to do a deep dive on it, because I think it exists, certainly in the UK. I have a bit of first-hand experience with some of the clients I've worked at, as you know, and there is this sort of sense, and very real sense, and I think it's well placed, that there is the government and these military contractors that are in bed together. Some of them are even part public and owned by the government, and there does seem to be this unholy marriage between the two, and therefore almost the need for conflict to justify their existence.
Yeah, and if any company's prime modus operandi is to grow and to increase their year-on-year profitability, and if their customers are governments, and the government contracts that are driven by hawkish foreign policy, then it certainly raises some questions about the real reasons behind going into these countries. Would, say, a Boeing or a Lockheed Martin have done too badly out of this conflict? No, they may have done very well. But the wider implications are dire.
Yeah, there's two things they're exercising there. They're keeping those sorts of companies which are key cornerstones in their economy, particularly the manufacturing jobs and all of that, but also having a robust exports, because that's a big business for Lockheed and Boeing, as well as almost a bifork of, yes, that, but also then exercising influence on the planet, on the world, and sort of just reminding everyone who the United States of America really is. And so I think there's a two-layer reason for us as to why they do what they do. But I'd love to almost do a deep dive and unwrap exactly some of that incentive around the military industrial complex, because I think it exists to a large extent in the UK as well.
I think the
it's
UK is
slightly less visible.
It's slightly less visible, and I think that's partly because nationalism and support in foreign policy interests is. I think the public is a bit more prudish on being too open about that. Whereas in the US, it's very much, there is no shame. There is,
right.
You've been to the States.
On the contrary, there's massive pride, right?
Absolutely, there's pride to kind of. I think there's an attitude generally, unless you're staunchly against it. There's an attitude of, okay, we are there. We have the largest military might in the world. Let's not be ashamed of it. Let's celebrate it. We might as well support. If we're pumping that much money into it, we may as well celebrate it. And I think, patriotism takes so many different forms, but in the US, it's very much intertwined with military intervention.
Yes, it's a weird thing to us Europeans, and maybe it makes more sense to you given you've spent some time in the US and now a lot more time in Canada. This sort of intertwined nature of how patriotism is kind of inextricably linked to military power and the military itself, and the amount of pride people take in that. Even at any sports event, there's a military presence, whether that's the flyover, whether that's Marines doing a parade. It's really interesting how it's just so ingrained in the psyche.
I think it's quite an interesting exercise living in Canada, because Canada is an incredibly patriotic country. It's different. The American variant of patriotism is different to, say, the British variant. Or I'll talk from a Canadian perspective, because Canada is incredibly patriotic, and everywhere you go, there's Canadian flags. They sing the national anthem at sports events. Children every day in school. When you go to a McDonald's or a Denny's in Canada, there's a maple leaf on the logo. It's all influenced by love for Canada, but the major difference is that patriotism is not intertwined with military presence and love for basically the armies of the state. So the US is a special case, and I'd imagine that you could perhaps make parallels with countries like Russia and China. But it's a very propaganda-oriented, pro-military variant of patriotism, and I think that there's some goodness in that, but I also think that clouds people's morals to an extent.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's almost fanatical. It's almost cult-like, I would say, especially from a European perspective, where that almost doesn't exist to any extent.
No,
I think coming into the US cold, it's quite easy to be taken aback by this. I'd say almost worshipping of the troops, the Marines, the military at large. It's strange. Let's put it that way. It's very strange, very alien from a European perspective.
I think there's definitely the patriotic groups in Europe are far more marginalised, and they're certainly not as intertwined with the love for the military.
No, and yeah, I think it's a healthier relationship with the military, if I may say so.
Probably a one that's more grounded in reality.
Yes.
And
yes, because I think the military almost serves more than just the purpose of being a military that defends the homeland and then enacts foreign interests. I think it's also there for either the sake of patriotism, for the sake of feeling American, whatever that means. It's so inextricably linked to what it means to identify as an American.
Yeah, it really is, and there's certain parts of the States, particularly in the South, where military service is just part of life, in a way that perhaps you and I would identify with our grandparents, and back then there was a draft, but in the US, in many jurisdictions, being in the military is just what you do as a man, and that's it. There's no two ways about it. Yep. There's a great quote, and I always forget the author, and it's patriotism is love for what your country does. Nationalism is love for your country, whatever it does.
Wow.
And that's kind of, I think you can definitely draw parallels to that quote and the way a lot of US citizens see the military, in the sense of, well, whatever it does, is right and can be condoned.
Yes, there is almost an unhealthy sense that, whatever the US military may or may not do, it's like we pledge our allegiance to the US military. It's a faultless system. It's a faultless entity. And I don't know whether that's just because they feel so part of it, but it's something I'd love to do a deep dive into at some point. That and the military-industrial complex would just be such a fascinating podcast, I think. Because it's always fascinated me that almost fanatical support of the US military in the US by Americans, and how much I think it's just almost an identity of who they are, as in who they identify as. I imagine it does create a strong sense of belonging and a strong sense of pride. I can see how it can, because there is a sense of vicariously living through these very polished, very well disciplined individuals, and that's not hard to put your shoes into, or actually almost stand in those shoes and understand the appeal.
It can definitely see a seductive quality to that aspiration. My time in America, I've often found that there's been this intertwining of individualism but also patriotic collectivism, and I've never seen another country pull that off. And I think that you're right, this kind of polished, perfect individual that's fought for his country and delivered freedom, or an American variant of freedom, elsewhere in the world. I feel like that's a big aspiration for a lot of Americans and a lot of American men.
Yeah, and I suppose nothing embodies that archetype more than superheroes, specifically Captain America.
Yes, yeah. Yes, and just I haven't been to the States in so long since the pandemic, but I just think the whole framework of the country is set up to reward military personnel. And, if you go on a road trip in the States for a couple of weeks, you'll notice everywhere you go, particularly if you're in the South, military discounts, whether you're at motels or McDonald's, whether you're riding the Greyhound bus or getting on a flight, there's discounts everywhere. There's incentives. The entire system is set up to make people join the military. I have friends that joined primarily for the free healthcare and the free degree that you get if you get honorary discharge.
Yes, so, I can see how that's how barbaric the US system is in terms of healthcare. You can see very quickly how the appeal of being in the military. And is that all it needs to be? An honourable discharge will get you free healthcare for life?
An honourable discharge overseas. So you don't. Yeah, you don't.
So it has to be overseas.
Yes, but you see, because
that's
of the
how they get you.
That's how you got to read the small print. But the chance of you being overseas are much greater than in, say, the Canadian military because of the overseas presence. Because the US has a lot of troops in Mexico, it has lots of people in Ukraine, it still has a lot of people in Germany as well. But the Middle Eastern presence as well. I mean, there's one friend of mine who was in the Coast Guard, which, believe it or not, is actually an arm of the military, and all they were doing for 2 years was riding up and down the channel in Kuwait, checking boats for search and seizure. Just did that for a couple of years. Very easy job. Came back to the States with free healthcare for life.
Wow, you can really, really see the appeal of that. And is that free healthcare for you and your family?
Yep, it's extended to your spouse, and I believe your children get it up until, I think it's 26. I have to fact check that. I think you should fact check that one. But that's
Wow.
It gives you a level of freedom, and I can see why people choose it, because it fits into the whole pattern of American life, the whole American journey, if you get what I mean.
Yes.
The kind of, you've given the ultimate sacrifice to your government and your country, and in return they've provided you something that even US citizens don't get.
Yes.
And that's I can just see such an appeal to that, and I wouldn't say that I would fall. I wouldn't say that I'd be immune to that appeal myself.
I can definitely see the appeal, particularly in a country where healthcare is by no means guaranteed, and when you do get it, the debts can be horrendous, and they often fall to your family. So yeah, there is definitely a clear incentive there.
Certainly. And just to finish up on this military-industrial topic, because I know we'll broaden the discussion on this on a future podcast, but for 2020, military spending worldwide, the US was at $778 billion. So it came in top. The second was China at only $252 billion.
Wow.
So it shows you the difference. And then in third, fourth, and fifth, you've got India at 72 bill, Russia at 61 bill, and the UK at 59 bill. So we made the top five. So quite impressive for a European country. But again, the US just dwarfs everyone else's. And that was so that accounts for 39% of total military spending worldwide that year. And that was actually a lower year of spending. So
that's insane.
Yeah, it was at 1.92 trillion in 20.
It does feel like the military-industrial complex, wherever it's sat, it is subject to a completely different set of rules. It's like it sits outside the rules in terms of what's allowed and what's spending. I mean, money is literally thrown at it, and with little regard for efficiency and project cost overrun and all that sort of stuff. It does seem to be like a burning pit of money, to be perfectly honest, and it's taxpayers' money, it's our money.
Right.
So I think I'm surprised, one, for the lack of awareness, and suppose two, it does make sense. It answers my second question. why there is little to no protest around this is because there's little to no awareness of it.
Well, and that's a great it's a great point you make there, because Richard Nixon actually completely relinquished the gold standard because of
Bastard.
the Vietnam War.
Yes.
The Vietnam War was the reason why that kind of 100% movement to fiat currency started.
Yeah, and God, I really want to get into fiat currency and Bitcoin again, but I do firmly believe, and I will talk to this at length soon, probably on our next podcast or two. We're in this dark age, right, of where we've moved away from the gold standard. We're in between the gold standard and the digital standard, and I do believe that digital standard is Bitcoin. And I think we're in this dark age of just bastardization of fiat currency, whereby there is unchecked printing and therefore the degradation of wages and real wealth. Because the denominator in which we are paid, in which we buy goods and services in any given country, is completely unchecked. That promise on the £5 note, or any pound note for that matter, that promises to pay the bearer of this note this many pounds in gold, has long gone, and we are still not in a phase, incredibly, whereby the money supply is kept in check in some way, shape or form via a digital standard. It will have to be digital. It will inevitably be digital. We're in a digital age. It doesn't make sense to go back to a gold standard, although that would also be better than what we have today.
I think a gold standard would be it'd be a step in the right direction, but also untenable, giving the inflationary figures that we see today. And it'd be very hard to kind of structure and wind the clock back to do that. I think digital will have to be the way forward, wouldn't it?
It would have to be the way forward, and it's the best way to make sure it's clear who's got what at any given point in time. It's also the only way I think you can do it now. I think for all of its benefits, it's difficult to track and subdivide gold effectively. I really want to get into that, but I do firmly believe we're in this dark age of unchecked fiat currency printing in between the gold standard and the digital standard, whatever form that eventually takes. But effectively, it will be a rebaselining, in my mind, a rebaselining of every currency on the planet. Rebaselining on two levels. One, that cash will no longer be needed or used. I think that's very clear already. That's inevitable. We know that 100%. Okay, so we're just going to go to a British digital currency. That's really no different to what we have today, because that's just the numbers that appear on your Nationwide account, whatever. That's no different. So we go to a British digital currency named as the British digital pound, or whatever they want to call it. It really won't change your life day to day at all, and you won't sense it or feel it. The second bit is that it needs to be pegged to a standard of some description, that standard being a digital standard, and I do believe that standard will rebaseline unchecked fiat printing currency that's predominated up until now.
Interesting. Tying this to the discussion we're having, I wonder what the implications on the warfare state and the military-industrial complex would be to digital currency. Because what a worry, right? What a Bitcoin and digital cryptocurrency is probably a scary prospect to military contracts, and obviously the government in general, because if critical mass builds up and moves away from a currency that can be manipulated, it kind of leaves the warfare state in a very precarious position.
Yeah, it does, and I think it harkens back to why Nixon did what he did, right? He needed cash quickly, and the only way to do that was to bastardize the currency, pull it off a standard that kept it honest, which was the gold standard, and that allowed him and gave him the license to print to indefinite amounts, which he needed to. It's so sad that was what drove him to pull the dollar off the gold standard, but it makes total sense. And
there's there's a great quote by Ron Paul, and ties in nicely as he's now jumped on the crypto bandwagon. But he said, "War is never economically beneficial except for those in a position to profit from war expenditures."
Ron Paul, I love that man. I love, you can just tell
Full of
he's
wisdom.
just real and he's honest, and he doesn't care. He dances to his own drum, doesn't he?
He does. He does not care. And he's not a troll either.
No, he's not.
Unlike Mr. Trump, who, in some respects, yes, he doesn't care, but then in other respects, he's obsessed with self-image, and he's an ultimate populist in that way. So Ron Paul, I think he's very genuine and very wise, and whether you agree with him or not, I find it hard not to respect him.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I wonder what kind of future he would have had if he had won that election.
Would have been a wild one. He's about 90. I think he's about 93 now.
Well, he's holding up. He could do it. They're getting older anyway, it seems, with Biden.
Yeah, is Biden 82, 83? Something like that?
Jesus, man, some of the videos I've seen, not so much the words, but just some of his actions in terms of following some bodyguards around the house on the lawn. It's happening ever more frequently. These seeming lapses in judgment, his cognitive abilities seem to be worsening day on day. If you realise, whenever he delivers a bit of speech, it's only fluid and understandable because he's reading straight off the teleprompter. He'll also leave very promptly after that to avoid any questions that would require him to actually answer ad hoc and on the spot.
That's very concerning.
It is concerning,
Yeah.
and to think that that's, in theory, the most powerful man in the world. I think there's a lot of puppeteers in the background pulling the strings, and I think they have to, right? Just to maintain the world's biggest democracy.
Yeah. Well, he is the commander-in-chief, so I'm sure that the image is there, but behind the scenes, if there is a real mental wellness question there, I'm sure that there's many puppeteers, keeping the act up.
Brobear, I think in conclusion, all we can say is that these are uncertain times. I think we're unequivocally with the people of Afghanistan in spirit. We hope that it has been a peaceful transition to date, but we're concerned about the future, and we can only hope that it will continue to be a peaceful transition of power, and hopefully not the regression that we're fearing, although more likely than not it will be. So we'll monitor the situation closely, and I'm sure we'll have a follow-up podcast in the not too distant future. What I will end with is the quote, the old lie, as they say, "Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori." The line translates to, "It is a sweet and fitting die to die for the homeland." The old lie. I particularly when I say that, I think about the troops and lives given over the last 20 years, and I think it's unfortunate that we are and sad that we're in a position we're in at the minute, and I can only hope that the future is brighter than today. Brotherly Bear, with that, I think we will conclude there. Thank you so much for accompanying me on this conversation and for giving your invaluable historical insight.
Thank you. Thank you for your usual wisdom and measured thoughts, Brother Bear. I very much look forward to delving deeper onto this subject through the military-industrial complex soon.
Thank you, Brother Bear. Over and out.
Over and out, good sir.